The town of Howard, Ohio, had always been the kind of place where nothing truly terrible seemed possible. Tucked among quiet farmland and narrow country roads about 40 miles northeast of Columbus, it was a place where neighbors waved from their porches, where people left their doors unlocked, and where the same faces appeared at the same stores and restaurants every week. Life moved slowly there, and routines rarely changed. For Valerie Haythorne, those routines were everything. Every afternoon she arrived at the Dairy Queen in nearby Mount Vernon, tying her apron as the smell of soft-serve ice cream and grilled burgers filled the small restaurant. The staff was small, almost like a family, and among them was Tina Herman. Tina was dependable in the way only certain people are. She showed up early for shifts, greeted customers by name, and laughed easily. She talked often about her two children, Sarah Maynard and Cody Maynard. Sarah was 13, old enough to roll her eyes at her mother sometimes, but still close to her. Cody, 11, was quieter and loved video games and riding his bike. On November 10th, Tina was supposed to start her shift at 4 in the afternoon, but she never came. At first, Valerie assumed something simple had happened. Maybe Tina had forgotten the time. Maybe her truck had broken down. In a small town, delays happened. Still, Valerie felt uneasy. That evening, on her way home, she drove past Tina's house in Howard. It sat quietly along a rural road surrounded by late autumn trees whose leaves had mostly fallen. The porch light was on. Tina's pickup truck was parked in the driveway. Everything looked normal. Valerie slowed the car for a moment, studying the house. If the truck was there and the lights were on, then Tina must be home, she thought. Maybe she had just decided to take the night off. Valerie drove away. The next day, Tina still didn't come to work. This time, the uneasiness in Valerie's stomach grew heavier. Tina would never skip work without calling. She loved the job, loved the people. It simply wasn't in her nature to disappear. That afternoon, Valerie drove back to the house. The sky hung grey over the farmland, and the wind carried the dry smell of fallen leaves. Tina's truck was still in the driveway, exactly where it had been the day before. Something was wrong. Valerie walked up to the house and knocked. No answer. She tried the front door. It was locked. She walked around the side of the house and noticed a window slightly open near the back. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should enter someone else's home. But fear had already begun creeping into her thoughts. She climbed through the window. Inside the house, everything was strangely quiet. The air felt cold and still. Valerie stepped into the kitchen. At first, she noticed nothing unusual. A few dishes in the sink, a chair pushed slightly away from the table. Then she saw it, blood. There was a large, dark stain on the floor, another smear along the wall. Drops scattered across the room. Her heart began pounding. There was so much blood that it didn't look like an accident. It looked like violence. Valerie stood frozen for a moment, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. This was not a small injury. Nobody had just cut their finger in this house. Something terrible had happened. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called the police. Within hours, deputies from the Knox County Sheriff's Office arrived at the house. They taped off the property and began searching the area. Inside, they found signs of a brutal attack. But the house was empty. Tina Herman was gone. So were her children. And another woman who had been visiting that night, 41-year-old Stephanie Sprang. 4 people had vanished. In a small community like Howard, news spreads fast. By nightfall, neighbors were gathering along the road outside the Herman house, whispering to each other in worried voices. No one could understand how something like this could happen there. Search teams began combing the surrounding countryside. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious. Helicopters circled the farmland. Every hour that passed without answers deepened the fear. 3 days later, the search brought a sudden, shocking development. Police received information that led them to a house in Mount Vernon, about 10 miles west of Howard. Inside the basement of that home, they found 13-year-old Sarah Maynard. She was bound and gagged, weak and frightened, but alive. The moment she was carried out of the house, officers felt both relief and dread. One child had survived, but the others were still missing. The man who lived in the house was Matthew Hoffman, an unemployed tree trimmer with a troubled past. Authorities quickly arrested him and charged him with kidnapping. For nearly 4 days, Sarah had been held captive in his basement, but investigators still didn't know where the other 3 victims were. The town held its breath as the search continued. Then, on a cold Thursday morning, Hoffman's attorney contacted investigators and said his client would provide information about the location of the bodies. What officers heard next led them to a remote wildlife preserve near Fredericktown. The preserve was quiet that morning, the trees standing bare against the grey sky. Leaves rustled beneath the boots of investigators as they moved through the forest. About a quarter mile from 2 small churches, officers stopped near a massive tree. It was an American beech, towering nearly 60 feet high. The trunk was hollow. Inside that hollow trunk, hidden in darkness, investigators found 3 garbage bags. Inside the bags were the bodies of Tina Herman, her son Cody Maynard, and Stephanie Sprang. The discovery sent a wave of grief through the county. How the killer had managed to place the bodies inside the tree remained a mystery. The opening in the trunk was large enough to hold them, but the act itself seemed almost unimaginable. Sheriff David Barber later confirmed that all 3 had been killed inside Tina's home in Howard. Autopsies were ordered to determine exactly how they died, but the horror of the crime was already clear. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Mount Vernon and Howard. People stood in silence as news reports described where the bodies had been found. A hollow tree in a quiet forest. It sounded like something from a nightmare. Authorities decided the tree itself had to be removed. Officials feared that if it remained standing, it would become a grim attraction. People visiting the spot out of curiosity. So wildlife workers from Ohio's Division of Wildlife were called in. The tree was enormous. Its trunk had grown hollow over many years, a natural process common in beech trees. On Friday morning, crews arrived with chainsaws and heavy equipment. They began cutting the tree down piece by piece. Gary Ludwig, a wildlife supervisor overseeing the operation, later said the tree was too large to move in one piece. It had to be cut apart where it stood. Sections of the trunk were stacked into a large mound in the preserve. The hollow tree that had hidden the victims was gone, but the memory of it would linger in the minds of everyone in the community. Back in Mount Vernon, grief settled over the town like a heavy fog. The tragedy felt deeply personal. Everyone seemed to know someone connected to the victims. At the Dairy Queen, the mood was somber. Tina's co-workers gathered in the booths where she used to sit during breaks. Valerie Haythorne struggled to hold back tears as she spoke about her friend. She remembered the moment Tina had failed to show up for work. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. Tina had loved her job. She loved the people who came in every day for ice cream and conversation. She would never have simply skipped work. Now her absence felt overwhelming. Customers who came into the restaurant spoke in hushed voices. Many had known Tina personally. Others had simply recognized her friendly smile behind the counter. Sandy Bird was one of those customers. She worked at a landscaping company where Matthew Hoffman had briefly been employed earlier that year. When she heard about the arrest, a terrible thought began haunting her. Hoffman had known how to climb trees. He had his own tree climbing equipment. That skill had likely allowed him to place the bodies inside the hollow tree. Sandy felt a deep sense of guilt she couldn't explain. She kept wondering if there had been some sign she had missed, something she could have done to prevent the tragedy. But like everyone else in the town, she had never imagined something so horrific could happen there. "When it's somebody who served you at the Dairy Queen 2 weeks ago," she said, shaking her head, "it's hard on everybody." Outside Tina Herman's home, a memorial slowly began to grow. Neighbors placed flowers along the walkway. Children tied balloons to the mailbox. Candles flickered in the cold evening air as people gathered to pray. Some knelt quietly in the yard. Others stood with their arms around each other, trying to make sense of the loss. For Stephanie Sprang's family, the grief was just as heavy. Her son, Michael Kupiec, spoke to reporters days later. He said he felt no hatred, not yet. He wanted answers first, until investigators explained what had happened, whether the victims had known the suspect, whether he had been watching them. There was nothing to understand. "We're just waiting," he said, "waiting for the truth." Meanwhile, Sarah Maynard, the only survivor, was recovering from the trauma of her captivity. Doctors and counselors surrounded her with care. She had endured 4 terrifying days in a stranger's basement, not knowing what had happened to her family. But she had survived, and that small miracle gave the grieving town something to hold on to. At the Dairy Queen, Tina's friends decided to help the victims' children in the only way they knew how. They organized a fundraiser. On Saturday, $1 from every Blizzard sold would be donated to a fund for Sarah and for Stephanie Sprang's children. Customers lined up around the building. People who had never met the victims came to buy ice cream, wanting to contribute in some small way. The restaurant also began collecting donations. Local officials worked with the mayor to set up bank accounts for the children. Everywhere in Mount Vernon and Howard, people were trying to support each other. The tragedy had shattered the sense of safety that once defined their community, but it had also brought them together. Late one evening, Valerie sat quietly in a booth at the Dairy Queen. She looked around at the restaurant, the counter, the menu boards, the tables where Tina used to chat with customers. For a moment, she imagined Tina walking through the door again, laughing the way she always did. But she knew that would never happen. "There's some peace in knowing they are not suffering," Valerie said softly. That had been one of the town's greatest fears, that the victims might still be somewhere, frightened and hurting. Now that uncertainty was gone, but the loss remained. The hollow tree in the forest had been removed. The investigation would continue. Trials would come. Answers might slowly emerge. Yet for the people of that small Ohio town, life would never return completely to the quiet innocence it once held. Because sometimes, even in the smallest and safest places, darkness can take root. And when it does, the echoes of it linger for years in the hearts of those left behind.